First speaker of the afternoon, Christina Cowart-Smith, currently studying a PhD looking at Anglo-Saxon sculpture and high crosses in particular, I think. So today she's going to be telling us a little bit about the assemblage at Abercorn in just near South Queensferry in Lothian. So Christina, over to you.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to be part of a conference in honor of Anna Ritchie's fundamental contribution to Scottish archaeology. And I have a personal indebtedness to Anna, owing to the fact that I, like many here, I'm sure, utilize her early medieval sculpture entries on Canmore almost daily, including in the making of this presentation. And I benefited from her thoughtful, generous email dialogue in recent months. I've been struck by Anna's kindnesses, particularly to someone at the outset of their academic journey. Thank you too to John Borland for the very kind invitation to give a paper. I know that I'm the junior member of this speaker lineup, and as such, I'm trying to choose being inspired over being intimidated, but I can't deny the intimidation is real. The paper I'll be giving today focuses on a site on the southern shore of the Firth of Forth, Abercorn. Abercorn was the seat of a northern Northumbrian bishopric founded in the last quarter of the 7th century. Only 4 years into its establishment, the bishopric was abandoned in the wake of Northumbrian defeat at the Battle of Dunnecton, and from this period, the textual record falls silent. Yet the impressive early medieval sculpture record, which survives at Abercorn, indicates renewed ecclesiastical activity at some point in the 8th century, or at the very latest, the early 9th century. I'm interested in Abercorn's particularly focused investment in freestanding or high crosses in this period. It not only accords with what we see at other major monastic houses up and down the eastern seaboard, but it is the largest assemblage of such material in southeast Scotland, bar Jedburgh. High crosses are good markers for focused artistic and economic investment. Unlike very simple incised or relief cross slabs, they evidence greater resources and skill. And at the very least, they show an understanding of how to engineer a freestanding, three-dimensional sculpture in the round, or rather a new way, since we have had an earlier tradition in this region of inscribed standing stones or slabs like those at Yarrow or Kirkliston. Moreover, not all early medieval ecclesiastical communities in Britain produced them, even some very important ones, which we might expect to. This paper opens with a brief historical overview of the site, giving context for Abercorn's pre-sculpture period. It then considers the archaeological evidence of Charles Thomas's limited excavations in 1964 and 1965. From here, the paper gives a broad chronological and stylistic overview of the early medieval sculpture before offering a detailed assessment of the site's early medieval high crosses. Only Gwenda Adcock's master's and doctoral research on interlace in Northumbria have given any sort of focused treatment to Abercorn sculpture. This particular paper, however, takes a view broader than Adcock's. It argues that, when seen alongside sites of contemporaneous high cross production in central Britain, Abercorn's high cross program reflects an intentional rebranding or repositioning of the site in the post-Dunnecton period. Moreover, this paper is especially interested in what Abercorn is doing visually that puts it in conversation with and sets it apart from other important northern Northumbrian ecclesiastical communities. As a result, comparisons will be made with Hoddom to the east and Lindisfarne and Hexham to the south. The paper concludes with areas of consideration for the future. And I note here that Peter Yeoman, Jane Geddes, John Borland, and Mark Hall, among others, would like to see the rich sculptural material at Abercorn someday redisplayed. I join them in curiosity and care, and with similar desire that Abercorn's spectacular sculpture not only be preserved, but appreciated more fully by visitors. Abercorn sits on the south shore of the Firth of Forth, around 5 kilometers west of South Queensferry. Today, it is a quiet West Lothian village, but in the 7th century, it would have been at a significant political and social crossroads. Not only did this region provide the overland routes for pilgrims and ecclesiastics journeying between the great monastic houses at Iona in the west and Lindisfarne in the east, but the site was positioned on a political fault line between Pictland and Northumbria. Alex Wolff has previously argued that Abercorn itself was close to, if not actually within, Pictish territory. Interestingly, Abercorn's place name has a decidedly Brittonic element, and as Bethany Fox has discussed with reference to W.J. Watson, the name translates to either the, quote, horned mouth or confluence, or else specifically relates to the mouth of the Corny Burn, that stream running beside the site. Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica refers to the place as Abercwnig in the Old English. Bede states that it was a monasterium and that it served as the seat of Bishop Trumwine, who was appointed to the position in 681 to oversee the Provincia Pictorum. As Charles Thomas has noted, Trumwine might well have already been at the site, presiding over a small community of monks prior to his appointment as, quote, bishop to the Picts. Certainly having a pre-existing community at Abercorn would have made the site's elevation to a bishopric all the easier. Abercorn's establishment as a Bernician bishopric was part of a more general division of the Northumbrian Church under the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore of Tarsus. The last quarter of the 7th century also saw the creation of separate bishoprics at Hexham and York. James Fraser posits that Abercorn's elevation to the seat of a bishop might have been a response to, quote, a real and perceived need, end quote, as much as it was a sign of raw Northumbrian or Canterbury imperialism. He suggests that Southern Pictish aggression towards the Northumbrians after the Battle of Two Rivers in 671 could have meant that Abercorn was established to undermine, quote, more ancient seas in Southern Pictland. It is from Bede that we get the narrative of the decisive battle in AD 685, which killed King Edgefrith and not only forced Bishop Trumwine and his men to flee the bishopric, but halted further Northumbrian expansion northward. Trumwine might even have been on that battlefield situated, quote, in the Straits of Inaccessible Mountains. The location of the Battle of Dunnecton has, of course, been the topic of much scholarly debate, with Alex Wolf's argument for Dunnecton on the northwest shore of Loch Inch standing as most convincing. But for our sculpture story, what is important is that from AD 685, the residential diocese at Abercorn is abandoned. Trumwine flees to the coastal monastery at Whitby, some 340 kilometers to the south, in proper Bernician heartland. And as an aside, Fraser posits that Trumwine's move southward may have occurred as late as 698, well over a decade after the battle. But what is clear from the surviving archaeological record is that nothing dates sculpturally to the 7th century, that is to the pre-Dunnecton Abercorn period. During the summers of 1964 and 1965, Charles Thomas set out to undertake, quote, limited exploratory work at Abercorn with staff and students from the University of Edinburgh's Department of Archaeology. In an article in 1984, Thomas writes that, quote, comparatively little was found in the limited time available, by which he refers to the fact that his team were out only once a week on a Wednesday afternoon. I must at the outset thank both Peter Yeoman and Ewan Campbell for their insight into Charles Thomas's work at Abercorn, given that Thomas himself published no full report of the findings. Peter and Adrian Maldonado visited the late Charles Thomas at his Cornish home in 2013, and from this visit collected not only the Iona Abbey assemblage, but also Thomas's boxes of Abercorn finds. A couple of years ago, Peter looked through these finds with Ewan Campbell, and it is thanks to Ewan's expertise that the verdict on the e-ware can be made. Thomas's excavation focused on the area immediately outside the north of the northwest corner of the churchyard wall, approximately 15 meters from the present church. The oldest masonry of Abercorn Church, which itself is dated to St. Cerf, dates to the later 11th century. Thomas identified a low bank running east to west as a possible early 7th century monastic vallum, which he associated with a narrow internal ditch. Within this, he identified one shard of, quote, e-ware from the ditch fill and another shard from the topsoil above the, quote, vallum. The problem with this identification is, however, that these aren't actually pieces of e-ware. As Ewan has shared from examining the pieces in person, e-ware doesn't seem to be found on the east coast of Scotland. Added to this, Charles Thomas excavated a small east-west orientated structure, which he suggested had an apse. Peter has thrown this claim into question and has talked to me through how this conclusion comes from no real excavated evidence. Thomas did, however, find beam slots, evidence of the foundations of a timber building. But Ewan and Peter caution that as A, no real records of this survive, and B, such structures can be later medieval, we again don't yet have excavated evidence for early medieval activity at Abercorn. Excavated small finds include quantities of post-medieval glass, bone, and ceramics. Peter shared that the redwares and grittyware were later medieval, again, chronologically corresponding to the probable date of those post holes, and that Ewan identified possible crucible fragments, but again, of a later medieval date. So we are rather disappointingly left with no archaeological evidence for the early medieval monastery at Abercorn. But rather than ending on this somewhat dreary note, I suppose that we can only wonder at what still lies beneath the soil. Hopefully one day Abercorn will once again be excavated and on a larger scale. Apart from Charles Thomas, the only relatively recent archaeological, or visual, I should say, research on Abercorn has been that of Gwenda Adcock. Adcock's master's dissertation and PhD thesis, both undertaken at Durham, dealt with interlace across Northumbria. At Abercorn, she isolated the interlace to examine it alongside examples from Lindisfarne and Aberlady. While useful in many ways, this approach decontextualized the paneled relief from its visual context. For example, what type of monument is the interlace located on? How does it fit into the visual programs of adjacent faces? Namely, in the case of a cross shaft, it interlaces a panel on a broad face, what's on the narrow faces. I mention Adcock's work to drive home the point that while certain individual carvings at Abercorn have been discussed, the Abercorn Assemblage has never been studied as a group of monuments. So let's consider Abercorn as an assemblage. Sorry, I've skipped too far ahead. It's freezing a bit. Sorry, there we go. I'll give a survey of what's at the site before delving into the freestanding crosses, as that's undoubtedly Abercorn's most significant sculpture offering. Abercorn has 12 fragments of surviving medieval sculpture. This slide has all the non-high crossy bits, minus the crosshead fragment, which has crept into one of those photographs. Most of these sculptures are kept with their high cross neighbors in the session house at the edge of the kirkyard. Others are located in the basement under the Hopetoun loft within the church. The most recent find, which I've not included in that count of 12, was in 2008 and is that curious figural carved stone in the upper left hand of your screen, which has been described as having a fish, a deer, a serpent, and quote, a monk's head. I think, however, that it takes a bit of faith to see a couple of those elements. The piece had been used for some time as a way marker to the closed west lodge gates of nearby Hopetoun House. In all, there's nothing diagnostically early medieval about it, and the shape isn't that of a cross shaft. Other images on this slide include Abercorn's 3 tegulated recumbent, or quote, hogback fragments. One of these hogbacks is complete, the other broken in half, and a third surviving only in a small piece. Note that the 2 floriated cross recumbents are certainly central or later medieval, so out with our period of inquiry today. And then we have a cross-incised slab, which is at the bottom left of your screen, in addition to another dress slab, which is plain apart from roll molding on narrow sides. On one of the sides, the molding encloses a lovely little segment of 3-strand interlace. Either one of these monuments might have been a recumbent early medieval grave slab. The chronological span of this assemblage shows that the site continues to invest in sculpture after the erection of its high crosses. The hogbacks, the floriated recumbent slabs, and possibly even the 2 other recumbent monuments, which I've said could be burial markers, would date mostly to the 10th century and beyond. And seen as a varied group, this later corpus of monuments might point to wider changes in monumentality and patronage in the mid to late 9th century, and definitely throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. That is a transition from public or communal monuments in this region, high crosses, centered at coastal ecclesiastical centers, to monuments erected for the individual, which we see in this region an increase in the number of burial markers. So before we turn to the focus of this paper, which is Abercorn's high crosses, I'll pose a question. What should or might we expect sculpturally in terms of high cross iconography from a northern Northumbrian ecclesiastical community in the 8th or early 9th century? I'm careful here not to presume that all ecclesiastical communities were monasteries. Let's look to Hoddom in the west. Hoddom has, or I should say had, a remarkable assemblage of high cross components, among them many figural reliefs. Most of the sculptures associated with the site are now lost and known only from 20th century photographs seen on this slide. As Derek Craig has noted, some of the sculptures here might have been deliberately broken up in around 1640, when an act was passed by the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in Aberdeen, calling for, quote, idolatrous monuments erected for religious worship, such as crucifixes, images of Christ, Mary, and the saints, to be taken down, demolished, and destroyed, end quote. A similar iconoclastic context can be ascribed for the fragmentation of the nearby Ruthel Cross. Evidence for iconoclasm at Hoddom includes the defaced face of Christ on one of the crossheads and the head of the lamb also expunged on another crosshead fragment. And you can probably see the latter example a bit more clearly on this slide. but a more detailed look at destruction and reuse of high cross components in this region and across Britain is another paper entirely. What's immediately striking, though, is the human figuration, something which we'll see we don't find at Abercorn. The Hoddom haloed figures leaning towards one another as if in conversation called to mind the position and modeling of similar figures on the late 8th or early 9th century cross shaft at Easby in North Yorkshire, but held today in the V&A in London, although the Easby figures are rendered in a higher relief. Holy figures, sometimes in pairs or trios, inhabit architectural-like spaces, either defined by neatly outlined registers, as on that cross shaft fragment we just looked at, or created by the shape of the cross component itself. Here I draw attention to the way in which Christ, or the Agnus Dei, is situated in, or rather springs forth from, a central roundel which occupies the circular space naturally made by the springing of the meeting cross arms. The sculptor also used the space in the cross arms to its fullest potential, a hor vacui of sorts, with saints and biting beasts squeezed within. A mutilated cross fragment from Masham, North Yorkshire, Masham 4, which is similar in size and shape, might have held a similar central roundel enclosed figure. This could also explain the damage centered very clearly on the center of the crosshead, since human or divine figuration was a target of choice for iconoclasts. In all, these figure sculptures, including the very fine cross shaft fragment in the lower right of the screen held today in the NMS, would iconographically fit in very comfortably with sculpture found at other ecclesiastical centers in Northumbria in the 8th and 9th centuries. I should point out that the crosshead with noticeably curved armpits in the upper right of your screen, almost wanting to come into a circular shape, would on stylistic grounds date later than the cross components I've just drawn out. There are other stylistically later high cross components from Hoddom, but I haven't included them on this slide. Before we move on, make note of the rosettes or floral motifs. This is something we'll return to as we look at one of the Abercorn high cross fragments. But what of Abercorn's southeast Scottish neighbours also producing their own high crosses? This slide showcases some of southeast Scotland's freestanding cross sculptural output. Abercorn is part of a cluster of coastal ecclesiastical sites. It is nestled deep within the Firth of Forth, unlike neighbouring Aberlady, Gullen, Oldham, Tinningham, and a bit further down, Coldingham, which very much face into the North Sea. Sculpture sites further inland are located on this slide as well. Among these, Moreham, Liberton Tower, Lasswade, Borthwick, and much deeper inland, Jedburgh and Gattonside. The latter is a fragment, fragment from Gattonside is possibly from the site of Old Melrose on the River Tweed. And yet Abercorn's assemblage, as we shall see, stands out. Aberlady gives us one extant high cross fragment, Gullen 1, Tinningham 1, Oldham 2 cross spaces, the socket of one of which is seen as a laser scan on the slide. Coldingham, that important textually attested double monastic house of St. Ebba, just down the coast from Oldham and Tinningham, and up the shore from Holy Island, gives us only one freestanding cross fragment, a cross shaft of similar width and identical depth to that at Aberlady. A drawing by Carr in 1836 indicated a second possible fragment, a slab which he deemed a cross shaft, but the evidence is inconclusive and the drawing is highly decontextualized. The point I'm making is that many of these important ecclesiastical foundations have left us a single high cross fragment. True, we're dealing with what remains, but the sheer number, let alone the size of the high cross assemblage associated with Abercorn seems not insignificant. Let's focus in now on these high cross components surviving at Abercorn, a sole crosshead and 4 cross shaft fragments. No bases or cross arms survive at the site. The cross shaft reset in a modern base, which is number 3 on your slide, had been reused as a window lintel inside Abercorn Church. A similar use is recorded for the cross shaft now at Carlowry Castle, number 5 on the slide, which had been built in as a window lintel for an outbuilding at Abercorn Manse. The long cross shaft, that's the second image, in 2 pieces in the session house, was used in the parapet of the bridge across Midhope Burn before being removed in 1934. The small fragment of the bottom of a cross shaft, your 4th image, also in the session house, was discovered in the graveyard sometime before 1903, when Romilly Allen wrote the early Christian monuments of Scotland. No monument biography exists for the separate crosshead, which is the 1st image, which today is held in the church basement. For the purposes of time, I'm focusing today on two freestanding cross fragments in particular, the key pattern cross shaft and the sole cross head. I will, however, set the stage with a brief discussion of the cross shaft in two parts. This is by far the most impressive fragment of early medieval sculpture from the site and the most complete cross shaft in all of Southeast Scotland. Its preservation and form probably owes much to its use in the parapet of the bridge across Midhope Burn, as I just mentioned. And what survives indicates that the original monument was impressively tall, over 3.1 meters, and would have been able to command attention from quite some distance away. This might be supported by its reuse context at Midhope Burn, and the fact that, given its heft, the cross is likely to have originally stood somewhere near that location, possibly in a landscape context. This screen includes details of the cross shaft orientated so that they're facing the right direction. That is, as if you're standing at the end of the room where the fire extinguisher is in this image. In addition to some very fine inhabited interlace, there is one rather unusual carved detail, curious at least in the domain of high crosses in northern Northumbria. See the scroll with tangled stems, which emerges from a mound-like base. While all other examples I can think of in this region include this detail at the base of the cross shaft, see here examples at Norham and Holme Priory, both sites in Northumberland. Our example from Abercorn situates this iconography near the top of the shaft. Sorry, I'm trying to go forward, it's freezing. There we go. Interestingly, there is no noticeable taper in the shaft as it extends upwards, something you'd certainly expect on a cross shaft segment of this length, but this might be due to A, the fragmentation, see how alternating sides of the shaft are cut off because of reuse, or B, there was actually a bit more shaft extending to the top than envisioned in an artist's drawing, as you can see on the right side of this screen. The effect of placing the root of the vine scroll directly below, or at least very near to the crosshead, forges an intimate visual link of cross shaft with crosshead. If the crosshead of this monument was indeed the rosette crosshead fragment, which we'll look at next, as this drawing suggests, then the crosshead is the blossoming plant which springs from that root, firmly planted in the final panel of the cross shaft. I'd like to make a last point now about this Abercorn cross shaft fragment before we move on to our two main high cross discussion points. Given the fine spots and sheer size of this particular standing cross, it seems likely that this monument, out of all high crosses at Abercorn, was almost certainly utilized as a boundary marker, perhaps delineating entry into ecclesiastical space. The shaft also boasts carefully drilled eye sockets for the eye of at least two of the interlacing animals. Similar sockets are found on the cross shaft fragment from nearby Aberlady, although that cross shaft is of much more compact dimensions than what we see at Abercorn. As Alice Blackwell has shown at that site, the sockets of that high cross yield evidence of having had glass or metal insets. Perhaps our Abercorn cross shaft had similar detail. The effect of sunlight or moonlight bouncing off of glass or metal would be particularly dramatic in the outdoors, and the monument would have taken on a different appearance with the changing hours or weather conditions of the day or night, something Heather Pulliam has discussed with relation to the Irish high crosses. The appearance of flickering in the eyes of the figural sculpture, phenomenological considerations I got to thinking about during a research trip in undergrad with a Byzantinist named Viscera Pencheva when we were looking at the reliquary of Saint Foy in Conques. This idea of a flickering appearance brought about by natural light or candlelight would surely have complemented and enlivened the probable painted colors of the high cross's surface. These elements together would have added to this freestanding cross's animacy and interaction with its living landscape. Let's move on to the sole crosshead at the site. Crossheads, and this includes arms, are comparatively rare survivals in the British high cross corpus. And the Abercorn crosshead is among the most impressive of its kind anywhere in Eastern Britain. The Abercorn crosshead is unusual. While we'll see that its iconography links it closely with other significant ecclesiastical houses in northern Northumbrian heartland, the overall size and projection of its boss is unlike any other examples. It seems to take a motif familiar in important northern Northumbrian ecclesiastical sites and take it to quite literally heights seen nowhere else. The main feature of the fragment is its prominent rosettes or marigold-shaped forms. Rosettes are featured on both faces of the crosshead. On one side, an 8-petaled rosette sits in low relief. On the other side, a stacked rosette boss protrudes nearly 4.5 inches from the background plane. It is surrounded by double circular roll molding. Rosettes are a feature of early Northumbrian ecclesiastical sculpture. They are found most commonly in Bernicia and are much less frequent to non-existent in Deira. I can think of one isolated example there. This slide shows some of these Bernician high cross rosettes. They are most commonly situated on cross heads, as most of our examples on the slide attest. There are, however, examples of rosette-like vegetation on uninhabited vine scrolls on a base from Hexham, that is Hexham 12, and cross-shaft fragments at Hoddom, Hoddom 4 and 5. Abercorn has the only examples of rosettes in southeast Scotland. You can see that the Scottish examples on this slide are from the southwest. They seem to be a feature of the Hexham school, as none of the high crosses at Lindisfarne have them. Moreover, Abercorn immediately stands out for having a rosette on both faces of the crosshead. I know of no other crosshead that has this. And I should say my PhD isn't just focused on Anglo-Saxon material, it's transnational, looking at freestanding cruciform stone sculpture as a tradition that's shared across Britain from Cornwall up to the west coast of Scotland. So to the point that there's no other crossheads that have a rosette on both faces, I've included here Hexham 8, both the front and back of that crosshead, with a back that's plain apart from single roll molding defining the sculpture's edges. Carlisle 1 has an extremely, is an extremely small inscribed crosshead. It's probably a personal memorial of some sort, just given its inscription. And it similarly has a rosette on only one side. And the so-called Nithbridge cross in Dumfriesshire, the closest to our Abercorn crosshead in terms of the size of its rosette, contains the motif again, but only on one crosshead face. At Hoddom, the rosette has moved into the cross arm, where the double cusp echoes a popular Lindisfarne style. The six-petaled rosette enclosed in circular roll molding on the crosshead from Hexham 8, is dated by Cramp's Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture to the second to last quarter of the 8th century. Similar dates are given to other fragments at Hexham, including now lost Hexham 9. This is on account of the shape of the crosshead, as the form is also found at Whitby on a series of inscribed crossheads discovered in excavated contexts. The Carlisle head is also given an 8th century date, and that's on epigraphic grounds thanks to its inscription, but very few freestanding crosses that survive in Britain are able to be dated on epigraphic grounds. So on account of this rosette motif, are we looking at an early high cross component at Abercorn, something perhaps dated to the last quarter of the 8th century? Or are we looking at a monument erected in the following century, as southerly parallels with the paired beasts on the Nithbridge high cross might suggest for that monument? The plainness of the crosshead at Abercorn, apart from the distinctive rosettes, as well as the double incised lines at the edges, only left at the armpits of the head, certainly do feel comfortable, in my opinion, within a late 8th or early 9th century context. But what Abercorn does with a familiar Northern Northumbrian motif is truly astounding. It is not until the 10th and 11th centuries in Northern Northumbria that we begin to see bosses projecting with this dynamism. I'm thinking here to a series of crossheads with high relief bosses at Gainford in County Durham, or the metalwork-like quality of the projecting boss on the crosshead at Tynemouth in Northumberland. I do realize that this statement rests on what remains, and the central section of crossheads are uncommon survivals in the transnational corpus of this material in Britain. But still, I don't think the uniqueness of this piece is merely up to chance survival. Abercorn is taking a motif familiar in the Northumbrian world and boldly transforming it, almost pushing it to excess, to its limits, certainly on the side of the massive boss. And this certainly shows the flair of an extremely confident sculptor. The second Abercorn high cross I'd like to spend a bit of time with is the cross shaft fragment erected in a modern base in the Session House. Here are all four faces of the upper part of a cross shaft. You'll be able to see where the shaft sprung into the crosshead in a subsequent slide. I have utilized some black and white images from Kenmore only because they draw out some of the relief a bit better. And in the case of the second of the two narrow faces, it helps to emphasize the height of that relief carving. What is immediately striking is the bold pattern of key patterns situated at the very top of the cross shaft. This image better allows you to see where the shaft curves into the base of the crosshead, which I've marked with a black arrow. It's evidently much easier to see this in person than in photos. Below this key pattern panel, we have the panel of interlace Gwenda Adcock studied, and at the bottom of the fragment, there is a bold double spiral ring knot. The shape of this latter element, while stiffer in form, calls to mind spiral scroll fragments from Hoddom and Luce, see inset images, in southwest Scotland. Norn to the south in the top left of your screen also provides another Northern Northumbrian example of a large volute of spiral scroll with a small petaled flower at its center. You can just make out similar petaled shapes coming off the spiraled centers on the examples from Hoddom and Luce. But back to the key pattern. In southeast Scotland, down into northeast England, that is Northumberland and County Durham, I've noted 18 occurrences of key pattern on high crosses. Southeast Scotland accounts for a third of these high cross key pattern examples, and Abercorn is the only site in southeast Scotland with more than one high cross fragment with key pattern. Abercorn has 2 such examples. And I pause to note here that my research is not key pattern focused, so I'm sure Dr. Cynthia Thickpenny could challenge me on some of these instances. And by this, I mean that a count of 18 instances of key pattern on high crosses is generous. It's an overcount, not an undercount. Regardless, my point is this: key pattern is not common on high crosses in Northumbria, nor on other sculpture types. It is not employed in this region with the fervor that we see to the north in the Pictish heartland. So for a statistic, take southeast Scotland and northeast England. There are approximately 300 high cross fragments between these regions. That makes for about 6% of high cross fragments with key pattern. And all examples of key pattern on high crosses in this region are found on cross shafts, apart from Herworth in County Durham, where a cross face has a bold, deeply cut key pattern. Thus, the key pattern which extends into the crosshead at Abercorn is, in my opinion, singularly unique in the surviving high cross corpus from Northern Northumbria. And I include southwest Scotland and northeast England in this final statement, given that the boundaries of what we might term Northumbria expanded and contracted over time. The key pattern extending into the crosshead, see the green arrow, on one of the cross's narrow faces might also be our clue as to the sides of this monument being carved at the same time. The other element that kind of unifies the sides is the double roll molding, which is seen on 3 of the 4 faces of this cross component. If we look at all sides of this cross shaft, as we do on this slide, there appears to be no unifying program to the monument. In Northumbria, key pattern is rarely, if ever, found on high crosses, which also contain vine scroll. An exception to this would be a couple of high crosses in northwest England. Dacre and Penrith spring to mind. At Dacre, a key pattern develops into a plant scroll, and the junction between those 2 elements is filled by a rosette berry bunch. Sorry, it's frozen again. There we go. A first example, if we take the 3 instances of vine scroll on one broad face and 2 narrow faces of this monument, which you see on this slide, we are left thinking that either multiple sculptors with different styles worked on this single cross, or else a sculptor had a wide variety of models at their disposal. These are 3 entirely different uninhabited vine scroll types. A first example, sorry, it keeps pausing, promise it's coming. There we go. A first example on a narrow face, face D, is generally what we might expect for a Northumbrian community. This single panel of scroll foliage has triple ridged nodes and a uniformity we see on panels, usually narrow faces, at Simonburn in Northumberland and Lowther in Westmoreland. Or closer to home, we have the example from the narrow face of the Aberlady figural cross shaft. Note, however, how the Abercorn sculpture undercuts the scroll, again, almost playing with how far it can become 3-dimensional, nearly popping off the background plane. This is to great visual effect, as light falling on this side can create deep shadow within the scroll. And you can see a bit of this in the black and white image on this slide. On the broad panel opposite the key pattern face, we see medallion scroll, later trimming for reuse. Again, this high cross fragment was used as a window lintel within Abercorn Church. The trimming is evidenced by the left margin, which has been chiseled off. The medallions contain fleshy leaves pointed in various directions. There are single berries and trilobed berry bunches, and some berries and leaves leave the scroll and occupy the space outside the medallions. Medallion scroll is again familiar in the Northumbrian world. Take Hexham, imaged here, where the medallion scroll conforms to rigid uniformity, rigid uniformity as if the pattern has been stamped on with precision. But at Abercorn, we again have a sculptor pushing the limits. There's energy and dynamism built into the sinuous curves, almost a playfulness at how far a familiar motif can be pushed and prodded. Based on other sides, and if this is indeed the work of only one sculptor, this is someone who clearly knows the visual vocabulary of a Northern Northumbrian monastery, and yet is riffing on it, to use a musical phrase. And now to our last panel, the second narrow face. Here we have a single panel of complex interlaced medallion scroll, by which I mean paired strands in a figure of 8 formation. Every medallion holds its own unique arrangement of elements. The very fine interlacing stalks alternately cross and then form breaks by avoiding each other by lying back to back. Breaks like this are something one does find in interlace, but are not common in Northumbrian vine scroll. There are twisted sprays of tri-lobed berry bunches and veined pointed leaves. Other leaves and single and bunched berries are located in spaces between the medallions. This particular carving is almost, if not entirely unique, certainly in high cross carving. I should follow up by saying that statement has been confirmed by Derek Craig, whom I came to with this piece after I couldn't find any meaningful parallels. Derek, who's editor of the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture, knows pretty much every monument in that corpus like the back of his hand, so I'm grateful for his willingness to give a second opinion. We might call this side virtuoso vine scroll. This Abercorn sculptor clearly knows the style book of Northern Northumbrian sculpture, and again chooses to improvise on it. In musical terms, it's like knowing a traditional tune, learning it to mastery, and then, and only then, being able to develop one's own voice and unique style. Is this at all a nod to the very fine, movement-imbued vine scroll of some of the Pictish monuments? Here I think to the Hilton of Cadboll, where elegant scroll holds elongated animals. There are, of course, many other examples, and this is by no means a like for like. I'm instead interested in the effects of the Abercorn vine scroll here. Again, it doesn't have the weightiness and solidity of so many of its Northumbrian counterparts. With these elements combined, can we say that Abercorn sculptor or sculptors were engaged with, or at least aware of, both a southerly, and by this I mean Northumbrian tradition, as well as a northerly or Pictish tradition? I realize that though key pattern is a common visual motif in the Pictish heartland, it doesn't necessarily mean that key pattern equates to Pictish presence. Lindisfarne, for example, has 2 surviving and 1 lost examples of key pattern on high cross components, and that monastery wasn't in the Pictish zone. But what Abercorn is doing is undoubtedly different than any and every other Northern Northumbrian ecclesiastical community, at least in terms of its high crosses. And if we return to the historical context, these high crosses are being erected during Abercorn's reestablishment as an ecclesiastical center. Lindisfarne's burst of high cross activity is concentrated at the tail end of the 8th century, probably more likely the first half of the 9th century. And this is significant because it means that that island's high crosses are on the whole produced after the first Viking raid in AD 793. This means that Abercorn is probably erecting its freestanding crosses at the same time as, or perhaps even slightly before, those on Holy Island are being put up. High crosses are now, quote, in vogue, and yet Abercorn is challenging and transforming and pushing to the limit that tradition. This cross shaft, as well as the cross shaft we looked at in 2 parts, and the rosette cross head, are massive and bold statements to Abercorn's new era. Before I close, I'd like to share a final word from Peter Yeoman, who's currently advising Abercorn Kirk Session and West Lothian Council on the development of a redisplay for the Abercorn Assemblage. Although to be honest, I'm quite jealous of him at the moment because Peter's hiking in Gran Canaria and so isn't tuning into this weekend's conference proceedings. As Peter shared in an email last week, the most significant achievement of the project so far has been getting John Borland on board to complete the first proper drawn record of the sculpture. What a thrill it will be to see and utilize these drawings in our future studies of the Abercorn sculptures. I can't wait to learn from John and the drawings that he will produce. I'll close here with a couple of final words on where we can take Abercorn sculpture from here. Jane Geddes very kindly passed on to me an idea that Mark Hall had shared with her in comparing the high cross assemblage at Curris with that here at Abercorn. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I did try to look up and make sure I'm saying it not completely wrong. Was Curris set up as some sort of Pictish response to the center at Abercorn? There are 3 cross components there, a massive cross base, mostly unornamented apart from a chamfer with interlace, and 2 very slender cross shafts. Additionally, more work needs to be done on sculptural connections between sites in Southeast Scotland, Abercorn included, and not just on the high crosses. My master's dissertation at Glasgow in 2017 compiled a catalogue of early medieval sculpture in the region, but evidently that's just a starting point. I'll conclude with a personal thank you to Anna, whose numerous careful entries on Kenmore have throughout the years guided myself and so many others in our studies of this and other regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was fantastic. Just remind everyone, if you have any questions for Christina, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and post it, and I will pass it on. We have one here. We have a couple, sorry. Okay, right, here you go, Christina, from Alison Reith. Would the high crosses have been made by local stonemasons, or would they have been made elsewhere and transported to their locations? What do you think?
That's an excellent question. And it deals with stone sourcing, I think, as well, which in this region, there is sandstone that's readily available. Rosemary Cramp had always argued that in this period, we see monastic schools producing freestanding crosses, and she saw freestanding crosses as emerging from a context at Wearmouth and Jarrow. Interestingly, though, there actually isn't many free crosses from those places, and they're not, in my opinion, very innovative. So to the question of who's producing these, I think we need to remember that there is a tradition of sculpture in this region before Anglian incursion. So I don't think it's out with possibility that we would have local masons already based in the region. But certainly with the coming of monastic presence here, I would be surprised if there are some sort of monastic schools as well. But I think more work needs to be done that, especially in terms of the stone sourcing. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, another one here from Fiona Campbell-Howes. I'm interested in the slabs you showed where only the sides were carved. Is it an unfinished commission, or did a workshop like this keep ready prepared stones with their sides already carved?
Do you mean the examples at Abercorn? There's only one example at Abercorn. Yeah, there's the one example with interlace on the side. That one's been heavily reused. So I think that the lack of carving on the front might also be because of its, well, the reuse. So I'm not sure we can make a definitive statement on that. I do know at other Northumbrian sites, we have examples of, and I use Northumbria as a broad term, not just a general term. We have examples of workshops where something is carved and then things are added later on. For example, the corpus of name stones at Lindisfarne, where we have examples of ready-made kind of materials that then could have an inscription added of some sort. So perhaps that's what we're seeing here too. But my expertise is not recumbent, perhaps grave slabs. So that's a great point.
Right. Yeah, I think you're probably right. It probably the blank areas are more down to it having been reused and scoured and defaced to some extent, I think. Okay, questions coming in thick and fast now. Do you think that some of the sculptural innovations at Abercorn might be due to its position within a contentious frontier zone? That from Trevor Wiley.
That's what I was trying to kind of push forth. In my abstract, I had said that Abercorn is displaying a distinctive Pictish element, and I think I have to be careful about just basing that off of one, component, as I said. But certainly Abercorn is the innovative iconography, or rather the way in which it is carved, that we see at Abercorn is unlike anything in the region, in my opinion. And now that I've amassed a corpus of freestanding crosses across Britain, it still continues to stand out. So definitely, I think its position in this political fault line is crucial, and perhaps adds to its innovative contribution.
Okay, Alison Reith has returned with a comment saying it's interesting to see that the carvings on the narrow faces of the Abercorn stones are very similar to wood carvings on Viking stave churches in West Coast Norway.
Right.
And then carrying on the wood theme, Bruce Manson is asking, are there any clues that the stone carvings emerged from a woodworking tradition?
This has been discussed heavily, obviously, in high cross studies. Yes, there's obviously there's that very famous quote about, or the reference we have to King Oswald raising a cross at the Battle of Heavenfield. The earliest crosses would have most likely been wood. And then we have the idea as well that we have metalwork crosses, processional crosses, crosses on altars, and that those would have informed the construction of standing crosses. So definitely, and unfortunately, the wooden crosses don't survive in the archaeological record, but certainly there must have been conversation between media. How could there not be? So yeah, and more portable crosses indeed. A freestanding stone cross is not the most portable medium when it's in its complete state.
It's certainly interesting that high crosses like St. John's Cross that are composite, made from more than one bit, are using mortise and tenon joints, which would have their origins in timber construction. Yeah, without a doubt. I'm pleased to say that I have actually made a tentative start with the material at Abercorn. It's
brilliant.
I have managed now about 3 weeks ago to access the results of the photogrammetry that my former colleague, V. Peterson, did there just shortly before she left HES and moved on to a new job. So thanks, V. I don't think you're watching today, but that's been a great start. And it's been such a tentative thing because every time I try to get in, there's some new restriction that I made a start at starting to clear my desk 3 weeks ago, which is the first time in almost 2 years since I retired. So, but I'm glad to say that I've made a start, and now that I have the material, I will be going through more frequently to get things going. And maybe I give you a shout, and we can maybe try and meet up sometime there. Yeah. Super. Well, I think that's all the questions done. So although we're